Earlier this year, F.W. Murnau's classic silent horror film Nosferatu celebrated its 100-year anniversary. And something else that's achieved the same milestone this year is actually a horror story, Herbert West's Reanimator, written by H.P. Lovecraft. I've been thinking about making some sort of video talking about the story and the films for a while now, especially since I've been cosplaying as Herbert West over the past year. So when I realised that the story is now 100 years old this year, I figured it would be a good place to start. Before I continue, I want to add that I'm not a total Lovecraft expert. There were some things about the story that I didn't know about when I was researching it, and I mainly want to make this video for fun. Word of warning, this video will contain spoilers for the story. To begin with, to be more specific, Herbert West's Reanimator is a short story consisted of 6 individual chapters that Lovecraft apparently wrote from October 1921 to June 1922 for an amateur pulp magazine called Homebrew, who published them from February to July 1922 under the title Gruesome Tales. Set during the turn of the 20th century in Lovecraft's fictional town of Arkham, the story is about a young medical scientist named Herbert West who develops a serum that can bring the recently deceased back to life. Except there's a major setback. Most of the time upon reanimation, they become insanely violent undead beings. All 6 chapters within the short story are only a few pages long, so the whole saga is just over 30 pages, and like pretty much all of H.P. Lovecraft's short stories, it's written in the first-person narration, told from the perspective of West's assistant, who helped him in his secret experiments of resurrecting the dead over a span of 17 years. The narrator details their early days as medical students at Miskatonic University, to eventually graduating and opening up their own practice in a factory town, and even eventually serving as medics during World War I, all the while trying to improve West's reagent serum and only succeeding in causing more death and chaos. Upon researching the history of the story, I actually found out that Lovecraft wasn't originally satisfied about writing a series revolving around one character, but agreed to write it because he would be paid $5 for each installment. Nevertheless, the story has gained in popularity over the years and has become much more widely known, especially thanks to the 1985 film adaptation directed by Stuart Gordon, which starred Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West. Even though the film is a loose adaptation of the short story, the plot combines a number of elements from practically every chapter, and even the sequel, Bride of Reanimator, which plot is even further removed from the original short story, still takes a few elements from the later chapters of the short story. Of course I want to talk about the films, and especially the sequels that never got made, but I'm going to save them for their own videos. Something I will mention though is that West's depiction in the films is a little bit different from how it's depicted in the story. In the story he actually has blonde hair and blue eyes, and he actually has more of a character arc, which I'll get into later. It's worth noting too that Lovecraft doesn't really specify what West's reagent actually looks like. It's up to the reader's imagination, whereas in the films it's of course bright neon green. Given the film's popularity, I have to say that Herbert West is arguably the most well-known human character in Lovecraft literature, with Cthulhu being his most well-known cosmic entity. Speaking of eldritch horrors, Lovecraft is perhaps best known for his cosmic horror stories that make up his Cthulhu mythos. Like I mentioned in the intro, I'm not a total Lovecraft expert, so it actually came as a surprise to me to find out that Reanimator was one of his earlier stories, written and published before stories like The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, and At the Mountains of Madness. I'll admit I actually prefer his Cthulhu mythos stories because of the sense of dread that you get from reading about incomprehensible cosmic deities like Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep. It's really deep stuff and enough to keep you awake at night, and even perhaps drive you to madness. That said, I still like Reanimator for Lovecraft's take on the story about a mad scientist, and I do have to give it credit for having an early influence on the zombie genre. It's probably the earliest example I can think of where the undead are created in a laboratory setting, despite the fact that they're not infectious. I want to mention too that even though Reanimator isn't really considered part of the Cthulhu mythos, it does share a connection with it, in that a few of the mythos stories are also set in Arkham and prominently feature Miskatonic University. It's also worth mentioning that Reanimator is apparently the first story to feature Miskatonic University. Moving on, something that gets brought up a lot when talking about the story is how it was very much influenced by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'll admit I've never actually read Frankenstein, and with the amount of film adaptations there have been of Frankenstein, I can't actually tell which one is most accurate to the book. However, I know enough about the story and the themes to see how Reanimator could be inspired by it, and even be seen as some sort of twisted parody of it. I'd need to read Frankenstein in its entirety, but basically you got Dr. Frankenstein and Herbert West playing God through scientific means, except Dr. Frankenstein is trying to create life from dead body parts, and Herbert West is trying to restore life to the dead. How Reanimator could be seen as a parody of Frankenstein though, is that for one thing it's absurdly gruesome, and in fact I think it's one of Lovecraft's goriest stories. There's the flesh-eating reanimated subjects, and of course there's the infamous decapitated talking head, who has become synonymous with the story and the film. Moving on, sadly Reanimator also gives you an insight into Lovecraft's racism and xenophobia, something that's been the subject of controversy regarding him and a few of his works for a number of years. In the third chapter, 6 Shots by Midnight, West and the narrator are called upon to tend to the body of a black man who has been brutally beaten to death in a boxing match, and the narrator makes some racist assumptions about him before concluding that his body must have looked worse even in life. Even though I do enjoy reading his stories, I have to admit that the straight up blatant racism in some of them does make me cringe. I won't go into further discussion about it, but I thought it would be wrong not to address it. Circling back, I think the thing that intrigues me the most about the story is the character arc of Herbert West. In the early chapters, you know what he's doing isn't morally good, but you get the idea that he's trying to achieve something that would benefit mankind. However, after every failed test, his character gradually becomes more sinister and demented, with his experiments in trying to restore life becoming less out of scientific interest and more out of morbid curiosity, which is something that the narrator observes in the later chapters. He has less care, compassion, or respect for the dead, and his horrific obsession eventually leads him to a point where he starts to see healthy-looking people as potential experiments. In the fourth chapter, The Scream of the Dead, a corpse that West reanimates actually speaks and screams, "Keep that damn needle away from me," strongly insinuating that West was responsible for killing him just so he can reanimate him. Things take an even more disturbing turn in the fifth chapter, The Horror from the Shadows, where he's experimenting on the body parts of dead soldiers during World War I. With every reanimated corpse that manages to escape, however, West becomes increasingly paranoid and suspicious that they'll eventually come to exact revenge on him, which is actually what happens at the end of the sixth and final chapter, The Tomb Legions, where they tear him to pieces and take his head. But the strange thing is that West actually accepts his fate before it happens, and doesn't even scream. Another thing I like about him is that he's also somewhat mysterious. You never know what his background is, or his exact motive for wanting to cure death in the first place. Wrapping up this video, I guess my final thought is that even though it's not one of my favourite of Lovecraft's stories, I do find it to be scientifically interesting, and as I mentioned, I like the character of Herbert West. He may not be as well known as Dr. Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll, but I think the legacy of Herbert West Reanimator is still impressive, and I think West himself fits in well with his other literary mad scientists. So that's about all I've got to say on the short story of Herbert West Reanimator. I know I missed some things. I didn't mention how each chapter begins with a brief recap of each of the previous chapters, but let me know if there's anything else I missed and I'll try to mention it in the comments. In the meantime, I'm also considering making more videos talking about other Lovecraft stories, including Dagon, The Color Out of Space, The Dunwich Horror, and The Call of Cthulhu. As for right now though, that's about all from me for this video, and I shall see you in the horror section.